Hello, this is Strategy Miscellany, and this is another Children of Dead Earth video. This one on concepts in module design. So, not only can you build your own custom ships from preset modules in the game, but once you have beaten a certain mission, I think it's Vesta Overkill, at that point, you can start designing your own custom modules. So you can build your own cannon, you can build your own fuel tank, you can build your own rocket engine, you can build your own nuclear reactor. And this is, of course, quite difficult. Even though, you're not being a real nuclear engineer, you're just messing with sliders, but still, it's based pretty heavily on real physics, and there's not really much that it does to instruct you on how to do it. You just kind of have to learn by trial and error. Just like with ship design, a good way to start is to look at your stock modules and just start editing them, moving the sliders around and seeing what happens. Also, it's not necessary to win the campaign. I beat the campaign entirely with ships built out of stock modules. However, it can let you build either insanely powerful game-breaking ships or just wacky concepts and just be creative. For example, I have my rejected concepts in ship design video, where I showed some examples of goofy ideas that you can do in part with custom module design, like the carrier, for example. So I would say there's kind of tiers in design difficulty. Tier one is basically where you're just doing tailoring almost. You're just resizing the material, the system, or changing the material. So fuel tanks and radiators are the most obvious for that, as well as some other things like crew modules. Tier 2 is kind of all the different cannons and weapons, really. It's conventional guns, railguns, coil guns, launchers. Conventional guns are the simplest of those, but all of them are pretty manageable. And then we get into a more complex tier with things like rocket engines, um, the electric engines like the magnetoplasmodynamic drive, uh, radioisotope thermoelectric generators, and lasers. And then I would say tier four is all of the nuclear stuff. So nuclear reactors, nuclear engines, nuclear warheads. And I will cover nuclear reactors in this. I will not be covering the nuclear warheads or the nuclear reactors. I just feel like I don't know enough about how those work to really cover them accurately. I'll maybe come back and do a separate video in the future. I'm also not going to cover electric engines, both for that reason and also because I don't really think there's much of a use case for them. Unless you're building some sort of weird like ion probe that has a ton of delta V but can't really accelerate or anything. So those ones I'm going to skip. I'll try and go over the rest of the stuff. And then I'll show some worked examples. So I built a little micro drone. I built a carrier for those micro drones, and then I built a re-engineered version of the stock solar lance. So I will get into it and start showing off the tier 1 elements. So one of the simplest kinds of redesigns you might want to do is just redesigning a propellant tank to be a different size. So for example, if you have a drive that runs on helium, but let's say you have a really small ship that runs on helium, a drone or something that's got a nuclear rocket engine, and you need something smaller than 250 tons. So what I can go do is go to this stock helium tank, and I can duplicate it, and then I can just start messing with the size. So what if I want one that's only, say, maybe not that small, but let's say that I want a 1-ton helium tank. Here we go. Now it'll let me type it. Oh, well, that's kilograms. But I can scale it up. And we'll get to where the reaction mass is 1 ton. And then the other thing I can do is I can change its shape. If I want one that's really sort of thin and squat, I can do that. If I want one that's really long and skinny, I can do that. Let's say that I want one that's really long and skinny for whatever reason. Maybe I'm building some sort of missile or something. And then another thing I can do is I can change the structure of it or add additional armor to it. So I could make this thing, say, an armored tank that has 5 centimeters of, say, carbon steel. Now, in reality, I would not want to do this because I've now got this tank that's covered in 5 centimeters of carbon steel, and it's so long and thin that the mass ratio is terrible. It's got way more mass holding the thing in than it's actually carrying in helium. So to fix that, let's say first we mess with the height to radius ratio, bring it down to more of just a squat little cylinder. And then let's say that we get rid of most of this additional armor. We'll just leave 5 millimeters on. And we'll choose something a lot lighter than carbon steel. Like we'll use this aluminum beryllium here. So now most of the mass of this tank is carrying the helium fuel, and a lot less of it is carrying the outside weight. If I get rid of this entirely, then now most of the mass of the tank, it's got a 4.2 mass ratio, which is still not great because we're carrying helium. If I was carrying something else, like say, let's say I was carrying RP1, basically kerosene, now my mass ratio is 20. That's much better. And I could even make this out of something lighter, I think. Just looking for a real light thing that actually can still hold itself together. Probably can't make a fuel tank out of potassium in real life, although the game will let you do it, so, you know, have fun. I mean, let's say we did a plastic one. It's polyethylene. So now you can see we've got this real good mass ratio, and we've got this little kind of pill-shaped 1-ton tank. So that's fuel tanks. Pretty straightforward. So then the next thing you might want to do is resize a crew module. So like here's a crew module with 30 crew. And let's say that we're making a huge ship and we want to have some sort of, you know, crew module that carries 500 crew. And you can make it really thin like this. It's built like a skyscraper, just like in The Expanse. So there's these internal decks sort of stacking up so that when the ship accelerates, they're standing on the floor. And then I can take this and I can make it, you know, anything from really long and skinny down to really flat. Let's say that there's 500 crew and 20 decks here. And then the other thing you can do is, I mean, you can make the module less or more armored. You could even create a radiation shielded crew module. You could shield it with lead or with polyethylene. Seems to work as actually a fairly good radiation shield in game. You could make a glass crew module. You probably shouldn't, but you could. You could make a super heavily armored crew module so that if you're really worried about it getting damaged by shots and the crew being killed, you could. I mean, it's going to cost a huge amount of weight, but you could create, you know, a crew module that has 10 centimeters of vanadium chromium steel around the whole thing. You know, at that point, this thing is going to cost a huge amount of money, and it's going to be extremely heavy. But this is for 500 crew, so we're building apparently a ludicrously large ship at this point. Alternatively, I mean, let's say that you wanted to have, you know, a bunch of really tiny crew modules around the whole thing for redundancy. You could have these little 5 crew pods. And in that case, you probably don't need much of a shell at all for them. So you can make a real light shell of, say this alpha titanium aluminide. And you could just scatter several of these around the ship so that you have redundancy. So the other thing that you'd be doing this resizing to regularly is your radiators. So let's say, for example, that, I mean, you can also change materials to the radiators, which is also relevant. So let's say that I've got this sort of generic looking aluminum radiator. It's good for taking heat off of things that don't get that hot. You know, it can't operate at a temperature higher than like 800 kelvins, but for something that's only generating heat at a fairly weak heat level of, say, 700 kelvins, it's probably going to work better than a silicon radiator. So let's say I take this guy, and what if I just want this to be a classier shape? So let's say that I take height is actually more like width. It's interesting that they call it height, but it really is more width. And so let's say that I bring this height down to 1 centimeter, and then I start giving it some taper. Let's say that I give it, say, 45 degrees of taper, or even say 60 degrees of taper. And now I've got these cool, rocket fin shapes. Definitely looks much more aesthetic, is arguably more protected against incoming fire. And the other thing I can do is I can make the radiator thicker. Which should eventually, I think this should dissipate more heat. Apparently not. I was thinking with these big radiator pipes it would be able to dissipate more heat. It looks like it's not actually. But what making it thicker does is makes it more protected against incoming fire. You can also even give it armor. And you could give it this surface finish, like, I mean, you could give it, a classy surface finish just to make it look good. You could give it a gold surface finish. But let's say that you wanted to sort of armor your radiators against incoming um, laser fire. I'm just looking here for something that's a good anti-laser material. I mean, you could use rubber, but then your radiators will melt or burn, and it would be terrible. I don't know why you can put explosives on your radiators. That seems completely absurd, but I guess if you wanted to. Um, but yeah, let's say that I gave them, a nice little outer coating of, say, where did that go? Reinforced carbon, say. And I put on, a centimeter or so of reinforced carbon. So now I have an armored radiator. Now, the disadvantage is that this makes the radiator a lot heavier, of course. But the advantage is it's now armored, and so it'll work a lot better to defend itself. And yeah, you can use this just to resize radiators. You can use it to make them cool shapes. You can use it to make them out of different materials. If you kind of want to stunt on the enemy by making gold radiators. A silver radiator might actually be worth making. It's got a good heat dissipation. There's a lot of things you can experiment with. If you have some sort of super high temperature module, you could make like a diamond radiator or something. So that's a common thing you'd do. Kind of the next thing that I should cover very briefly is ammo modules. So if you build your own sort of weapon or something like that, you can build an ammo module for it. Like when I built my new model micro drones, I had to build a little carrier module for them. It's very simple. You can just, you can armor it if you want to. You decide its capacity. You can make it long and skinny or short and squat. And that's really all there is to that one. I guess one I forgot to mention that I should cover very briefly is refuelers. There's these base game refuelers. Basically, so if you have, say, a big ship, like a tanker, it's going to need one of these or multiple of these to refuel other ships. The ones in the base game are all kind of overpowered, to be honest, in my opinion. So if you're making your own carrier, maybe you want to make one. You want to keep the hose length out to a kilometer, probably. I mean, you might as well. Um, but what you can do if you want to build a carrier that doesn't need quite so much power, a tanker that doesn't need quite so much power, you could make just like a little pump. So let's say this thing only does, 400 RPMs and is only 30 centimeters. Now it only takes 11 kilowatts. Now it's going to take a lot longer to refuel a ship, but you can build your tanker without needing big, huge reactors and radiators on it. So advantages there. So I'm going to accept this one so that I have a light version of a methane refueler. All right, having covered those. Oh, I guess there's one more. So spacers, this is just to put a space in, and you can create your own custom spacer if you need, say, just a little space of 20 centimeters like I wanted. Radiation shields. So you can take a radiation shield. All the base game ones are polyethylene. You can experiment with other materials, like I built a lead radiation shield here. It's very heavy, but that's an example. And then there's a trick you can do with radiation shields. You can use them for basically armor-piercing warheads. So let's say that I take this polyethylene radiation shield. I'll duplicate it. Now let's say I make it out of something that's not really for radiation shielding, but for smashing into enemy ships. Like, let's say I make it out of osmium, because it's really heavy. And then I give it just a tiny radius. Like, say, 8 centimeters. 8 centimeters. And then, let's say I give it some height. And now imagine I put this guy on the front of a big missile that's meant to just crash into the enemy, a kinetic kill missile, basically. Imagine that just goes screaming in. This is going to smash up an enemy ship pretty well. 273 kilograms. It's extremely dense. It's a nice long rod shape. So, yeah, you can use radiation shields, not for their intended purpose. Just something to mention. So, we're on to talking about weaponry. One thing that you might want to do is mess with some of these conventional guns. So, like, say, here's a 120 millimeter cannon that they give you. It's okay, but it doesn't have a turret on it. So if you put it on a regular ship, it's going to not really be able to hit the enemy very much. And there's some other things we can do to improve this guy. I think I can probably make it more accurate. I can change the rounds a bit. I can probably make it reload faster. So let's say that I duplicate this guy and want to make like a big gun for my ships. So now, miraging steel is a fine steel to use. You can mess with other things that you would expect to make a gun out of, like ferritic stainless steel if you want is a fine one, or vanadium chromium steel. Really anything that would, make sense as a gun barrel will work fairly well. Tungsten's a decent one. I honestly don't know enough about how these work to give super great examples of what you should use. Here's a nice zirconium copper one, though, if you wanted to look a little classy. And you can also add a layer of barrel armor on the outside if you want to just give it a nice shape, or if you want to give it some anti-lasering armor. Like aramid fiber is the classic anti-laser armor. I don't want 3 meters of it, though. That would be cost prohibitive and also make my turret terrible. But we'll go ahead and put a centimeter of aramid fiber on the outside of this guy. So then I can get more muzzle velocity if I, increase the length of this guy. There are prohibiting factors to that. Eventually, the barrel will deform from stress, and also it makes it a lot harder to put a turret on this. It also makes it, more obvious as a target. And then the other thing you can do is you can mess with the propellant. Oxygen is probably a pretty good one, honestly. I mean, you can experiment with the others, certainly, but Octogen's a pretty good one, honestly. I can add more explosive to this guy. Eventually, I would have to increase the thickness of the barrel to make up for the fact that I'm adding more explosive. Let me find one that's got better tensile strength here. Nice thing is with these things you can sort by, say, yield strength. So let's say I go back and I make this out of amorphous zirconium steel. I can probably get away with a thinner barrel. I can pump more explosives into it. And then this grain radius is kind of how fast your explosive is going to burn. Now, the thing is, by making this thing at kind of the limits of its firing range, I've made it a lot less accurate. You can see it's only accurate out to 9 clicks, even for a big capital ship. So it's not great in that sense. Now, another thing I can do is I can mess with the projectile. So, I mean, depleted uranium is fine. If you want the densest, you want something like osmium or iridium. Osmium's honestly a pretty good one. It's got good internal strength. It's not that expensive. It's very heavy. It's kind of the standard one that I like to use. You can stunt on them with a gold projectile. You can use tungsten here. And you can see I've made the projectile so big that it will shatter from internal pressure. So what I can do to deal with that is I can increase the barrel size here. Yeah, let's say that we want this to be like a 200 millimeter cannon, for example. Now I can make my projectile a lot bigger, which means it imparts more energy when it crashes into them. You can see the projectile energy here. 19.7 megajoules. And then I can up the explosives, give this more power. It'll decrease its accuracy, but it'll up the muzzle velocity so that this guy has even more power to fire. And a nice thing I can do is I can change the tracer here to give it a pretty color. So you kind of have to think like fireworks with this one. So, this copper, for example, that'll give it a green tracer. You can see it firing those. Let's see. What are some other good examples? Of a good tracer color. So sulfur provides a nice yellow. And there is a wiki page, like a fan wiki, that'll tell you these so that you can look them up yourself. Gallium nitride providing a nice kind of pinkish purple. I like that one. I'll go with that. Got to thicken the barrel a little bit. And you can see by thickening the barrel a little more, I can get a little bit more accuracy on this guy. Also by lengthening the barrel, and I'm getting more speed. So this is like my big guns for the ship, 200 millimeter cannons. Now I can take the loader, I can jack up the power on this guy. And if I'm willing to, use a megawatt of power for the loader on this, I can get it to fire easily 3 shots a second. Now the next step is what we want to do is turn this into a turret. And so we have to build a turret for it. And it has to be large enough to actually, you can see the turret kind of growing there. It has to be large enough to actually hold the weapon in it like that. I can make an extruded turret so that it has a good firing arc, although it will make it a little bit more vulnerable. You can see it kind of sticking out of the ship there. So I should probably give it some kind of armor. Oftentimes for this, anti-laser armor is the best because lasers are going to be the first things to hit your ship. And then the next thing we need to do is mess with the momentum wheels. You can work with electric actuators. I haven't had much luck with them. But momentum wheels, basically, you've got these big spinning flywheels. The faster they spin, the more your turret has capacity to move. The heavier they are, the more your turret has capacity to move. The only problem is that making them heavier will also mean more electrical power is used to move them around. So let's say I make them out of constantan, some kind of alloy, fairly heavy. And now this guy, to get a decent turning speed, is going to take a lot of megawatts of power because of how heavy I've made it. Like 34 megawatts right now to operate the turret, and it's still slow moving. So let's deal with that a little bit. Let's reduce this guy down to a 5-meter barrel and reduce the thickness of the barrel down to like 27 centimeters. I'm just kind of tuning down my cannon a little bit. That's the problem with making turrets for these big guns, is that they're extremely expensive in terms of power consumption to get the turning speed up to a reasonable value. All right, so now this guy uses 11 megawatts, but it fires, 8 shots a second with a 22 kilogram round with, a decent muzzle velocity. It's not very accurate, but, you could put this on, you could turn off the range and really just blast with this. And if any of the shots actually hit the enemy, they're going to do massive damage. 19 megajoules is a lot for a projectile. It's expensive. I mean, it's about a million It's about a million credits a gun, but you only need maybe 2 or 3 of these on your ship as its kind of main blasting armament, and you're kind of good to go. So I'm going to accept this one, and then I have not attached an ammo bay to it because with conventional guns, that's dangerous. You'll end up with Battle of Jutland scenario where your turret gets hit, the ammo cooks off, it destroys significant portions of your ship, possibly blows up your whole ship. Or at least, kills your crew with the concussion force of the explosion or by breaking their fuel. So then what we need to do is build an ammo module for this gun. So the supplied module is going to be my 200 millimeter turreted cannon. And let's say that I want to have, something that can supply the whole ship. So let's say that I want 3,000 units of ammo in there. You can see this one's an explosion hazard, so you want to keep it somewhere safe. And let's say that I build it as this kind of long and skinny thing. And what if we even give it a little bit of armor just to make it a little bit safer? Alright, so this is our ammo module for our cannons. It carries 3,000 ammo, so it should be able to supply, 3 guns, 1,000 ammo each, which if they fire 8 a second, will keep them going for like 2 minutes of continuous fire. That should be plenty. I'll go ahead and hit accept. You can attach this to your ship. Next weapon to talk about would probably be the railgun. And a good way to start with a railgun is also to look at one of the starting railguns. So let me find one of those. So like I say, this is actually kind of an excellent design. This 11-meter autofire railgun. It goes fast. It shoots a decent-sized round. It's fairly accurate. So let's look at this and see what are the good parts of its design and what we can fiddle with. So you can see here it has a capacitor. So this capacitor charges up from this power consumption and then fires. The nice thing with that is I can actually change its capacity here, its power consumption here, and that won't change into the other stats because the capacitor is charging fully before it fires. So all this will do is change its fire rate. So if you wanted to build this gun on the cheap in terms of power consumption, you could build it to only use 900 kilowatts there. Now it's built with a reloading motor that uses 13 megawatts, so we gotta decrease that too if we want this to be built on the cheap. That'll increase its reload time also. But yeah, put this at 900 kilowatts also. And now it'll only fire basically once a second because of those two changes, but it's also using, 1/13 of the accumulated, or not of the accumulated, but of the power capacity of before. So capacitors. Unfortunately, there's a bug where if you try to use multiple capacitors, it just doesn't work very well. So you kind of just got to bolt one capacitor on there. Mica is a good dielectric composition. Another one that's commonly used is hafnia. This will make it hafnia is heavier, but it will store considerably more power. You can see this is trying to shoot the thing now at 64 kilometers per second. Now that won't work because the design is not intended for that. So what we can do if we use hafnia is we can make a much smaller capacitor. And then I can mess with, the separation on those. Get this back into a good shape. Hafnia just works differently, so you kind of have to fiddle with the capacitor design a little bit. All right, so that's pretty good. Now we've got the reload down, even with our 900 kilowatt consumption. Let's go ahead and up that charging grade a little bit here. I'll go ahead and make this a 4 megawatt design with, say, 2 megawatts for the loader. So if it's doing everything at once, it's going to use like 4.5 megawatts. And now it's firing, something like 8 or 9 shots eight or 9 shots a second. We do have an issue where the projectile is being damaged. And I should be able to change that with a few things. When they say armature here, they mean projectile. I don't know why they call it an armature. So, I mean, one thing I can do is just widen the bore a little bit on this guy. Make it a 12 millimeter cannon. Railguns really work best with real light projectiles, in my experience. So I'm going to even lighten this down. And I'm going to use a heavier projectile here than zirconium, or one with a stronger tensile strength. Like, let's say this ferritic stainless steel. Okay, that's real close. So if I... There we go. So now we got this guy firing at 6 kilometers per second, an 8.5 gram round. And then the other thing you can do is mess with the rails, of course. Interesting that longer rails are making it both less accurate and slower. I'm not quite sure why that is. Okay, I think it's because it's accelerating over a longer period of time or something. And then increasing the thickness basically increases the accuracy a little bit because the rails aren't bending so much. Got your boron carbide around the outside of the rails here. Now, one thing I didn't mention is what this payload button does. So it doesn't really work very well for a railgun because it's meant for tiny projectiles. But for a conventional cannon or a coil gun, you can actually make it launch something else. So you can build a cannon that shoots, say, I mean, up to a ludicrous size even. You could launch, something like a 70-ton Hellfire drone out of a big enough cannon. That's going to be pretty difficult based on its diameter, but it's an option. You can also launch a flak module. You can launch just a big high explosive thing. I built one earlier that launches these 200 kilogram chunks of high explosive, which is pretty funny. You can launch nukes out of it if you want to turn your screen into a strobe light. You can start a missile by launching it out of one of these, which is nice because it makes the missile, start with a good shot towards its enemy. So building one that fires like these micro missiles is how I did one of my earlier designs, and that actually works pretty well because the micro missile, you can see it doesn't have much delta V of its own, but if it's already flying towards the enemy at a kilometer per second or so, maybe 2 kilometers per second if you're in a closing velocity with it already when you fire, then that makes it much more effective. So that's how the payload thing works, and basically you just have to bolt the payload in and then use a really small, like, sort of base projectile that then carries the payload. The projectile just becomes a sabot and is ignored. I feel like this doesn't need that much ammo. I think 40,000 shots is plenty. I am going to up the power consumption to get this thing so that it's... so that it's firing more than one shot every 10th of a second. And then what I need to do is get this projectile to stop being damaged by the size of this thing, or not the size of this thing, but by how dense the shot is. Let's see. What if we use vanadium chromium steel? There we go. This one actually does use electric actuators with a big magnet. And here we go. So I would, of course, change the name of this because it is no longer the original design. This is a 5.5 megawatt, 8mm railgun. So you can see how you can mess with the design to kind of make your own thing. I can compare this to its original design if I go back to the page here. So mine fires a tiny bit slower, but its muzzle velocity is a little bit faster, and its accuracy is a little bit higher. And most importantly, it uses about half the power of the other one, and also costs only about a third as much. Or more like a quarter as much, really. So honestly, they're both pretty good weapons. It's really just depending on what you need to build for your particular purpose. But it's nice that you can do these kind of comparisons here, so you can see how your design compares to the one you built it from. So now let's talk about coil guns. So this is a heavy coil gun. Fires a 5 kilogram round. Now the problem with it is it takes 6 seconds to reload. It's not super accurate. Let's see what we can do here. So this one clearly is an example of a design that I'm going to have to think about more before I can get to work. Let me look at another coil gun example real quick. So like here's another one. Here's a baseline internal capacitor coil gun that they give you. Part of the problem with it is it will overheat basically instantaneously. So let's see if we can fix that. Okay, so by upping the size of the projectile a little bit, it's no longer becoming magnetically saturated, which is good. And then another thing we can do to prevent it from overheating is we can just make the whole structure a little bit larger. Now what if I give it silver armor to wick heat away from it? So I can encase the thing in a huge amount of silver to avoid an overheating issue. Basically used as a heat sink. And then another thing I can do is I can up the power consumption to make this fire faster. Just messing with the capacitor a little bit. If I make the capacitor larger, it will have more muzzle velocity, but it will fire slower. And then I do want to put this on a turret so that it can actually rotate and fire at a reasonable rate. And the momentum wheels are still using considerably less power than the charger, so we're still good there. We can make it extruded if we want it to have a better firing arc. And I'm just looking at some different possibilities for the material to use for the coils. Okay, so if I cover the thing with a big mass of graphite, apparently that gets rid of the overheating issue. Or maybe it was the thick armor around the whole thing that was so conductive with heat that was causing the overheating issue. Because now we don't have an overheating issue. And if I up the power consumption to 600 kilowatts, I can get the thing to fire once a second with a muzzle velocity of 3.76 kilometers per second, so easily more than twice what a conventional gun has. And this one you can go ahead and use an attached ammo bay. I don't think this will need more than 800 shots. So here we've got an actually decent coil gun design, 5mm bore, 600 kilowatt power consumption, fires once a second, and actually has a decent amount of range You know, it's firing these tiny little plinking rounds. I could increase the round size a little bit, actually, without too much trouble. That makes it more efficient and doesn't actually change any of the reload factors or anything. So let's go ahead and up this guy up to this here. And let's try a different barrel type. Make sure it doesn't have that overheating issue still. That's good. It doesn't seem to. All right, so now it fires a 7.5 gram round once a second at 4 kilometers per second. You can see the efficiency's gone up a little bit. And the projectile energy is only 61 kilojoules, but you know, with it being so small and fast, it's still pretty good. So let's accept this one, and let's compare it to the thing that it was created out of here. You can see mine fires considerably faster, is a little bit less accurate, fires around 7.5 times the size at close to the same velocity. Mine is a little bit slower velocity and requires a little bit more power, but mine has an actual turret on it. So, you know, there are a few advantages to this old model. It's a little bit cheaper, but I would say that mine is the superior design here. So last kind of weapon thing to talk about. I'll also maybe cover blast launchers in another video. I don't really know enough about them to design them either. But we got to talk briefly about these carrier modules here. Now, the funny thing is this starts with all the ship types you've designed in alphabetical order. So right now it's trying to build a thing that can launch a 9.8 kiloton ship. So almost 10,000 tons of ship it's trying to launch out of some sort of imaginary supercarrier, I suppose. Yeah, here you could have something that is a carrier launcher module for cargo stations. That probably wouldn't work, but you know, imagining it is kind of fun to think about. So let's say that we want to make a launcher for, say, um, what's a good example here? One of these drone types would be good. So let's say that we have these Stinger drones here, and we want to build a launcher for them. Cobalt, I think, is a fine material. We want to make this track a little longer. Gonna have to make it a little thicker too. And then the Forcer is an electrically conductive material. So I like to use something a little more electrically conductive than aluminum. Like, for example, copper or silver are good examples. And you can see right now the muzzle velocity is very slow. This thing is launching them at 42.2 millimeters per second with a 1 hour reload. There's reasons for that. Part of it is that our coolant is too cold. So let's jack up the temperature. Having a high operating temperature is honestly good for these things. It feels kind of counterintuitive, but it's what you should do for space stuff. Because radiators will work more efficiently if you actually have a lot of heat coming out of them, or a high temperature coming out of them, is what I meant to say. All right, so now we can jack up the power consumption on this so that we can get the reload down to a reasonable value. And by sort of scaling up the whole thing here, well, actually, the forcer we should maybe make a little smaller. Well, no, it looks like there's an optimum size for the forcer, and it's right about here. All right, so the problem is these Stinger drones are pretty big, so if we want to launch them at any reasonable rate, we're going to need to use a lot of power. But here we have something that can launch one drone every 7 seconds, and it uses 3.5 megawatts of power. It's going to produce an output of 820 kilowatts of heat at an output temperature of 838 Kelvin, which is not too bad. The radiator should be able to do that. And you can attach an ammo bay to this, or you can use a baseline ammo module. You can tell it to auto fire by basically giving it an engagement range and having it either target ships or shots. This should probably target ships and start firing pretty far out, like 60 clicks, maybe 50 clicks. Although really what you're going to do with this probably is pre-launch them before you get into combat and then do like a drone strike at range, something like that. But yeah, that's how you can make launchers. This is for 11-ton drones, so that's why it's needing, so much power to launch them at a reasonable rate. But if you were building, say, like micro drones, like I do later, you can launch them quite a bit faster for quite a bit less electrical power. So the last weapon type module we need to cover here is lasers, which are the most difficult. I honestly don't fully understand them. So let's look at a base game laser module and see what we can do to mess with it. So here is a 13 megawatt green laser. And let's say we duplicate it and start looking at what it does. So you can see it's got this cavity here. And one thing we should be able to do, I think, to increase its efficiency a little bit is mess with the cavity shape. Maybe not. Maybe it's as efficient as it gets. Okay, yep, as efficient as it gets right now is 96.9. Possibly by building a larger cavity, we can make that more efficient. And it's still not that big, so let's go ahead and see what we can do here. Okay, yeah, that's marginally more efficient there, 98.3%. Reflection, I mean, silver's probably a pretty good cavity wall. I can try some others and see if they do any better. They probably will not. Yeah, no, it looks like the best we're getting. Well, and aluminum is melts to a low temperature too for this to work. So silver's the best we're getting for that. You can mess with the aperture radius. A wider aperture will make it more intense, as more powerful, but it'll also make it easier for them to target your turrets and blow them up. The best thing to do probably with these lasers is to make them unmounted. That way you can build laser mount turrets for them after you build your laser. There's some different types of setups you can use with them. This one is a Krypton diamond setup. Let me try something real quick and see if I go to fused quartz, if that works better or worse than diamond. Okay, so that one, the problem is that it's not strong enough. We could increase the size of the arc lamp and see what happens. And then it starts making the cavity shape less efficient, though, and also the frequency doubler. Let's say that we make the cavity even larger and see if we can get the cavity shape efficiency up. Okay. Still doesn't like that, though, so let's go back to diamond. What I find is making the cavity basically almost as round as possible without being totally round makes for the most efficiency there. So now you can mess with the size of the lasing rod too. Looks like this one's pretty optimal. You can give it more optical nodes, which will make it more efficient slightly, but also makes it a lot longer. Like here, it's a kilometer long. That's clearly not going to work unless you're building the Death Star or something. But here, we'll make it 10 meters long. That's okay. And then, of course, you can just, stuff more power into it. At which point we'll have to run more coolant through. But, let's say we jack this up to be a 25 megawatt laser. Then you just have to run more coolant through this guy. Now you could try like decreasing the coolant temperature to see if you can get more efficiency out of it. Doesn't look like that actually works in this case, so we should probably keep the coolant temperature where it is or so. Because again, running hotter is better up in space. Now, one thing we could do is we could throw a second frequency doubler on this guy. I'm going to make it out of the same stuff as the first one, just assuming they know what they're doing. And duplicate it here. So basically, I'm going to make the frequency doubler look the same as the first one. I think that makes sense. If that doesn't work, I'll try something else. Okay, that's pretty good. Maybe I can make this one better too. There we go. Now we're not losing anything with the frequency doublers. The problem is our focusing mirror is made of silver, and apparently silver is not reflecting these near ultraviolet frequencies very well. So I got to try something else. Okay, looks like molybdenum's the best we're going to get there. So we are losing some efficiency by using a high ultraviolet laser or a near ultraviolet laser, but that makes it better at basically blasting through enemy stuff. And yeah, generally the higher frequencies seem to tend to do more damage. So I'm willing to make that trade of having slightly lower intensity. I'm going to up the aperture radius a little bit too, and up the engagement range, the default engagement range to 30 clicks. And this will tell you the intensity at selected ranges. But basically this here now should be a pretty good laser. You're never going to get this efficiency very high. I think there's some mods that change that, but in the base game, your efficiency is just never going to be that high. Let me try something though real quick and replace the cavity wall with molybdenum. No, it doesn't like that. Better put that back to silver. Let's see, that's 85. That's 88.5. All right, we'll stick with that one. So now let's say we accept this. And then what I want to do is build a turret for it. So I tell it that I want the turret to relate to my 25 megawatt near ultraviolet laser. And we should give the turret some kind of anti-laser armor. Good ones are nitrile rubber and aramid fiber. I'm going to use nitrile rubber for this one because it's a little bit cheaper. Oh, I do want you to be a turret. Basically, non-turreted weapons on ships are not good. Non-turreted weapons on drones are okay, because the drone is small enough that it can kind of do its own thing and turn the whole body of the thing in a way that actually makes it work. So I'm going to cover this guy in 8 centimeters of nitrile rubber. And now we just have to make the turret wide enough to actually fit the darn laser. So you can see now we have our big turret with the laser coming out. If it were a normal laser color, you could see it. But because it's ultraviolet, you're not seeing it. It would just be giving you terrible sunburn, probably blinding you. So let's see, I want it to target ships and shots. And I'll go ahead and use momentum wheels and get this thing moving. We'll give it some heavier momentum wheels, make them out of iron. And I want the turning speed to be like 50 or 60 degrees per second. And the good news is it still uses under 100 kilowatts, which given the laser itself uses 25 megawatts, is not a very big deal. So there's your turret for the laser. You can bolt those on all over your ship and have the laser have multiple places to fire from in case one of them gets destroyed or if one of them's just not pointing the right way. And let me just do, I'm just looking here. So here's my laser design. I'm going to compare it to the 13 megawatt design that I built it out of. So you can see mine is considerably more intense at ranges, as you might expect. It is, however, heavier and more expensive, and uses more output power and requires more heat to be dissipated. So there's definitely disadvantages there, but that's what you can do for laser design. All right, the last design type I want to talk about. No, not the last design type. Well, I think I'll put nuclear reactors in the other video with nuclear rockets once I know what I'm doing with those. I'll have a whole nuclear design video. But I will show off one kind of nuclear design, which is the radioisotope thermoelectric generator, because that's simpler than a reactor. So let's say that we take this guy as a baseline here, and we duplicate it. So this produces 17 kilowatts. It's using promethium-147 as its fuel. I guess we'll allow that for now. So I can give it more fuel, and it'll run more power. But it'll start to get too hot. So we got to run the turbo pump a little faster, I think, is what we got to do there. That doesn't seem to be helping. Maybe I need to lower the exit temperature if I want this to work. Yeah, that's what I would have to do, is lower the exit temperature, which is a problem because it means the heat is harder to dissipate on this thing. Another thing I can do is mess with the thermocouple. But really what I think I want to do is change this fuel to something that can work at a hotter temperature. So promethium, okay, but we're going to replace that. We're going to use some classic plutonium instead. Okay, now it's actually producing wattage, which is like the first thing we need to work on here. Maybe this plutonium-240 is just not strong enough. Maybe if I use plutonium-238, I can get something out of this. Yeah, here we go. So a lot of what you're going to be doing with these guys is like resizing them. So let's say that I want just like a tiny one. I don't really need that much wattage. I'm building like a drone or something. Yeah, I mean, a lot of this is just kind of trial and error almost. But that's it. I'm trying to build just like a little tiny guy. So yeah, let's say that I just need 192 watts to work with. Here I've got this little guy that will generate 192 watts for me. Only weighs 12 kilograms. You can easily put that on a drone. Although it's still pretty expensive because of the plutonium. Let's see if I can make this a little bit cheaper here. Yeah, since I'm not worried about like output heat anymore, I can make this out of cooler stuff here. And because I don't have to worry about the output temperature being so hot anymore, I can use stuff that has a lower output temperature to make this more, or lower operating temperature to make this more efficient. So yeah, let's say that you just need a tiny one, you know? This only generates 44 watts, but it only weighs 2 kilograms. You could stick this on a tiny little drone or a tiny little missile. Something that needs, for whatever reason, a tiny bit of power. You could stick this guy on. It will need a little tiny bit of radiators, but other than that, it's a nice little power generation source. You can also scale these up, but really the RTGs are meant for small stuff as opposed to the big stuff. I guess there's no reason to make the pump large, too. Just trying to make this thing as small as possible here. There we go. Now it's 6 centimeters by 5 centimeters. You can stick this on anything and it'll work for you. It is still reasonably expensive at 23.9 thousand credits because plutonium 238 ain't cheap. But we've got this down to just a tiny size. Let's accept this and see how it compares to the stock RTGs. So the smallest stock one generates considerably more power, but it's also considerably heavier. It's 38 times heavier. Now that's an interesting one. I don't know why they built it that way. But yeah, there's definitely stuff you can do with RTGs. If price is your concern, you can use a different material. Like, let's say, this is so expensive. Let's say we ran this on something else, like Cobalt 60. Looks like you need a lot less Cobalt 60 to generate the same amount of power, too. On the other hand, it produces a lot of radiation hazard. Cobalt 60 is serious business. So, anyway, that's not a great example, but as you can see, you can make a lot of different RTGs. Last thing to cover is conventional rocket engines. A lot of what you're doing with these is resizing them, honestly. So, for example, let's take one of these generic liquid oxygen methane ones here, blasting away. And let's say that you just, there's a lot of different things you could do. You can change how it combusts. You could use liquid oxygen and RP1, so basically kerosene. You could use liquid oxygen and propane if you want to build your King of the Hill spaceship. You could use chlorine and hydrogen if you're insane. You could use fluorine and ammonia if you're even more insane. And so, yeah, there's a lot of great little examples of different rockets you can design. Let's see. I'm just looking for a good example of what I want to build today. Let's say we build one that's a hydrogen peroxide RP1 rocket. So this tells me it'll need 7.39 units of mass of hydrogen peroxide for every unit of RP1. I can mess with that by messing with the stoichiometric ratio. It's going to make the exhaust velocity worse. But because RP1 is denser, it might be worth it to you to do that. Take the stoichiometric ratio all the way down here. And then another thing that you're going to do is probably just resizing the thing. So the first thing to do is just start making all the parts of it smaller. So decrease the throat radius there, and then start decreasing the pump radius to match. And then, of course, decreasing the gimbal radius, because you don't need such a big gimbal anymore once your rocket is so large, or once your engine is a lot smaller. And then you can kind of do some trial and error with how the chamber shape is. See if you can get that exhaust velocity better or worse. The nozzle expansion, you can give it a longer nozzle, which will make it heavier, of course, but you're going to get better exhaust velocity out of the thing. Expansion angle of the nozzle is, again, a thing you can mess with to do the same sort of thing. You can see by giving this a long barrel, I've made it a lot heavier, but I've also given it better exhaust velocity. Now, if I mess with the stoichiometry again, I can probably make this even better. Let's say that we bring the stoichiometry up to 0.75. And then if your nozzle starts getting too hot, something like that, yeah, we can actually reduce the thickness of our chamber now that we're building on a smaller scale. So yeah, now we've built a much smaller version of this rocket that you could use for, say, a big missile. And you can take this down until you're building things that are just like, tiny fireworks at a certain point. Let's say we really want to build just a tiny thing. So we start taking the throat radius down to like 1 centimeter. We start reducing the pump radius down to similar. And then we start taking the gimbal radius down to similar. Then we got to mess with the chamber contraction. Until pretty soon you've built this thing that you can fit on, a tiny little rocket. This only weighs a kilogram. You could put this on a tiny missile with, 50 kilograms of fuel on it and just send it blasting away. And it would work beautifully. So that's how you can do rocket engines. Honestly, most of what I do with rocket engines is just kind of resizing them so that they work on tiny little things. Sometimes I experiment with different reactions or different stoichiometry. So having seen all of those, I will do a future episode. I guess there's one more thing to cover. You can build your own flares. I might do that on a future episode. I've never really done anything with that. But you can build your own warheads for missiles. So like this one is if you want just like pure high explosive. You can choose what kind of explosive you want. Let's say TNT. And, you can build something that's, 10 kilograms of TNT. And then what you want to do is probably put a detonator in. So let's say activation range is if we're within 400 meters. Minimum range, we'll make sure it doesn't blow up our own ships within 110 meters. Hard range is 0, so it'll go to closest approach, which will hopefully be impact. We'll have this target ships, and you can put this on the front of a missile and have it slam into enemy ships. Now, you can also build a shrapnel flak module, basically. You can put some shrapnel around this. So let's say for shrapnel, you want to use something dense and strong, like platinum molybdenum. Serious business there. And let's say you encase this in 50 kilos of shrapnel generating platinum molybdenum. And it'll tell you it'll generate 9,155 pieces at 5.46 grams a piece. Now, the problem is, and let's say we want to set this to detonate at a hard range of 100 meters away from the ship so that it detonates and the shrapnel blasts it. This is for your flak missile. Now, problem with this is that there's a bug with how flak works. Basically, to save on computer cycles, it gets destroyed or deleted from the simulation like 1 frame after it's generated. So unless it hits the ship basically instantly, it's just not going to do very much. Now, what you can do too is you can just use a tiny bit of explosive so that you're making really big pieces of shrapnel, which is kind of interesting. So let's say that we have just this little thing here. Now we're going to produce 434 115 gram pieces of shrapnel out of this with just this tiny bit of explosive in the center to kind of crack it as opposed to shatter, as opposed to just vaporizing it or anything like that. So that's an option too. Let's see, what else do I need to cover, if anything? So nuclear stuff, so nuclear reactors, nuclear engines, probably nuclear warheads. Although I'm a little nervous about putting that on YouTube. I will probably put that into a second video in the future. Blast launchers will also go in that second video. And the other thing that'll go in there, aside from nuclear, is resistojets and magnetoplasmodynamic thrusters. Because, again, I don't really understand how those work. I don't think there's really much of a use case for resistojets. They're kind of just worse rockets in a lot of ways. Magnetoplasmodynamic thrusters can give you crazy delta V, but not very good thrust, and they also eat a huge amount of power. Nuclear rockets definitely useful. I just don't understand them well enough. They're basically a nuclear reactor bolted onto a rocket. Nuclear power plants I sort of understand in the game. So I could add them to this one, but it's getting so long, I think it'll work better in another one. So let me show you kind of a worked example. So this is the new model micro drone. I designed some tiny little rockets here that run on liquid oxygen and kerosene on the back, Paralox rockets. I gave it a tank of RP1 and a tank of oxygen, both custom tank sizes. I designed a custom 12 millimeter cannon, so basically the size of like a rifle round, that sort of thing. It fires shots basically 36.8 milliseconds. It'll fire a shot, so it's firing something like close to 30 shots a second. Its accuracy is not great, but the idea is that the drone will get it in close and then it'll open fire. And it actually has a turret on it, so even if the drone's not pointed the right way, it can still open fire. It does use some power to run its turret and its linear motor. And that's why this has a 370 watt radioisotope thermoelectric generator stuck on it. A tiny little radioisotope generator of my own design, runs on strontium. It is quite expensive. I could probably make a more efficient version of this, but this is the one I came up with at the time. And then it's got for armor, it's got aluminum, and then it's got a little bit of nitrile rubber on the outside, just on a front cap to keep the front safer from lasers. I'm actually going to jack that up to 1 centimeter worth of nitrile rubber on the front. So basically it has like a rubber cap to try and keep it laser safe. That's also on the turret. And then it's got these little aluminum radiators of my own design and some rocket engines. And basically the idea is that the new model micro drone launcher on the ship that this is carried by can put these out at very high speed. So this is the new model micro drone carrier. It uses stock nuclear thermal rockets, stock methane tanks. It has 3 of these new model micro drone launchers here, which you can see can put out a new model micro drone every 2 seconds. I think I'm actually going to make these go a little faster here if I can. Okay, so now it can reload. Now it can reload every 1.46 seconds. So it's sending out a micro drone every 1.5 seconds. I have 3 on a ship. So therefore, together the ship uh, can put out basically a micro drone every half second. And so what does this have on the ship other than those? It has an ammo module with 100 micro drones. It has 3 of these thermoelectric fission reactors. This is the stock design that has a really high operating temperature. So that's why I can afford to just have a few little tiny radiators on this. The radiators are more efficient at that high operating temperature. It's got 3 of these turreted capacitor railguns of my own design, which they have great accuracy at range, and they fire really fast. They fire 9.34 kilometers per second. They have an accuracy out to 56 clicks against a capital ship. They fire basically every half a second, which is not great, but they only use 600 kilowatts of power, and they're generally pretty good. So that's one of the ships I designed. The other one, find it here. Oh, and I also put a few lasers on it for basically attacking incoming missiles. The other one is the Solar Lance Mark II. So the stock Solar Lance, as you may know, is kind of terrible. It's got these huge apertures on its lasers, and basically they just get destroyed every time that you try to use it, because it only has one aperture to fire out of. And so it just doesn't work like it should. So this is my attempt to make it work like it should. So I kept the hydrogen deuteride as the propulsion. It's kind of an unorthodox design choice, but it does give it great delta V for the amount of fuel it carries. It needs a huge amount of radiators because it's running 4 97 megawatt reactors of my own design, which are slightly better than the stock 60 megawatt reactor, but I'm still not great at designing those. And what it uses those to power is primarily it has 2 190 megawatt lasers of my design here. Let me see if I can get this frequency doubler to work a little better. I'm just going to try and make this frequency doubler work a little better. Because if I could get that, this would be more efficient and therefore a better laser. What if I tried with one of these other ones? Yeah, there we go. I just needed to switch it to potassium titanyl phosphate. Potassium titanyl phosphate. And now this guy actually works considerably better. So here we've got this laser. Out at 10 kilometers, it's still firing with intensity of 4.03 gigawatts per square meter. Its aperture radius is 45 centimeters, so not huge, but not tiny. And it has turrets attached to it. And that's the other advantage. It has 14 of these turrets armored with aramid fiber, so that even if many of the turrets are shot off, it can still fire 2 lasers consistently at the enemy. So that's the idea there. Give it this nice gold cap for style. It also has 8 centimeters of boron filament on the front of it to give it some extra armor on the front, as well as the standard reinforced carbon-carbon and amorphous zirconium steel, and a little bit of boron carbide for kind of anti-nuclear Anti-flash from nuclear blasts is really what that's meant for. So let me demonstrate how these work in an actual battle. So let's do this around somewhere pretty like IO. I guess IO might be considered more striking or dramatic than pretty. But I'm going to give myself one Solar Lance Mark II and two of the new model micro drone carriers. And I'm going to put myself up against a couple of laser frigates, these stock laser frigates. And one of the standard gunship, the Terror of the Spaceways. So you can see their fleet is considerably more expensive than mine and considerably heavier than mine. I think I can still defeat them. I'll just give it a try and see what happens. All right, we are right behind them, it looks like. Let's see about getting an intercept. All right, they're launching flak missiles at me. Thankfully, well, number one, they don't seem to be actually hitting me. They seem to have changed their orbit themselves. All right, here I think I can do an intercept on them. And that looks like a good intercept to start with anyway. I might have to mess with some of that closest approach business when we get closer. All right, yeah, let's see if we can get a better close approach on them. There we go. That gets a closest approach of like 1 kilometer. And we're right over Io, which will be very dramatic. Oh, that might have been their missile fleet that I was trying to hit there. Let's see. There's their capital fleet, which has dodged me and somehow put me into a collision. So I got to deal with that. Can't be colliding with Io. They're actually being a little crafty today. I got to give the AI some credit for that. All right, let's try this one here. All right, here we are. Here they are, dramatically over the surface of Io. I'm going to turn the range limitations off on my lasers. And I'm immediately going to start firing off new model micro drones. I want each ship to fire 60 of them and have them start flying towards the enemy. Their railgun should come into range basically automatically pretty shortly. All my ships are going to orient nose forwards. And now let's set up some targets. Those are kind of the most important targets on the gunship, plus the biggest targets. Same philosophy with laser frigates. And let's get started. So you can see immediately we're launching new model micro drones. We're damaging each other's stuff. You can see my lasers firing at there. I think that's a railgun mount. And immediately they start firing at my new model micro drones in large numbers and disabling them. Now the advantage there is every time their lasers are focused on these new model micro drones, they are not focused at all on firing at my laser modules and destroying them, which is normally what they do if they don't have anything else to shoot at. They'll start dealing with my solar lance's laser modules very quickly. Whereas me, now, right now, the solar lance is firing. Nobody's firing back at it. It's beautiful. Okay, they did take one laser mount off, but I have 14 of them for that particular reason. Yeah, I'm definitely, taking some incoming fire at this point. But let me see how my micro drones are doing. If I can get a wave of them in close enough, once they're in about 20 kilometers out, I'll take the range limit off on their guns and they'll start opening fire. And even though they just have tiny little guns, enough of them doing massed fire can do some real serious damage. So that's the plan. You can see them getting closer. And, I fired 120 of them. So far, they've damaged, it looks like, maybe 22 or 23 of them. Yeah, once we get a little bit closer, I will open fire with these. All right, we're getting close enough. I still have 80 of the darn things left. Let's ignore range. Let's watch one come in and open fire. And you can see the sky just opens up with cannon fire from these micro drones. Very bad for the frame rate. So yeah, as you can see, their fire is just obliterating this poor laser frigate. Looks like their fire is pretty focused on that one laser frigate right now. Hopefully they'll choose another target once it's damaged. Let me see what this looks like if I pause here. Okay, yeah, you can see now they're firing on the gunship, but because they're flying away, their gunshots are pretty weak at this point. And only 28 of them are still operating. Then we've got the other laser frigate here, which is starting to lose its radiators and its railguns. And then what do my ships look like here? Yeah, so the Solar Lance has lost all of its laser mounts. It's basically useless now. But the new model micro drone carriers are still here and still firing away with their railguns. Well, this one's lost all its railguns. I'm going to have ignore range on laser turrets instead. And I think I might have to have these guys launch another wave, even though that's going to be terrible for the frame rate. but we'll go ahead and do it. Well, they have disarmed my last ship, and so unfortunately it looks like it is a victory for the bad guys. Quite possibly kind of a Pyrrhic victory, considering how many of their ships they lost too. Basically, both forces kind of obliterated each other, really. I mean, their laser frigate. This one laser frigate is doing okay. The other two ships are destroyed or badly damaged enough to be out of the fight, as are all three of my ships. My last little micro drones here are hundreds of kilometers away, and I don't even know why they're still showing up here. Honestly, it's not like they can do anything. But I'm going to leave that in just as a demonstration that I'm not that great at module design yet. But hopefully I at least gave you some ideas to play with. And yeah, I think module design is a very fun part of this game, even though I'm not very good at it yet. So thank you very much for watching, and have a great day.